Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Matt Ewalt. I serve the Texas Tribune as Senior Director of Events and Live Journalism. Welcome to those joining us here in person in Odessa and those joining us online for our We the Texans program focused on local news and democracy. Between 2005 and 2022, Texas lost 65% of its newspaper journalists, according to a 2023 report on the state of local news. And while there are alternative local news outlets like TV stations, public broadcasting stations, digital-only sites, and ethnic media organizations, it is extremely difficult to fill the gap left behind in communities as newspapers shrink or shutter completely. With the growth of news deserts, communities without reliable local news sources often see an increase in the mistrust of media and other institutions, and residents are often victims of misinformation. But people in Texas and beyond are talking about solutions. In today's Texas Tribune conversation, part of our We the Texans project looking at the state of democracy in Texas, we'll talk about news deserts in the state, the real impact that communities are facing, and what can be done to address the issue and ensure Texans across the state have access to reliable local news. We're joined today by Mitch Borden, Permian Basin reporter for Marfa Public Radio, Patrick Canty, publisher of the Odessa American, and Benjamin Toff, assistant professor at Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Minnesota. Our moderator is Nic Garcia, region's editor for the Texas Tribune. I should note, previously announced Ellen Clegg, co-author of What Works in Community News, Media Startups, News Deserts, and the Future of the Fourth Estate, wasn't able to be with us today, but we do look forward to being in conversation with her in the future. Our program will run 1 hour with 45 minutes for conversation and 15 minutes for your questions here in Odessa. We have a mic stand right over here for our in-person audience, and our virtual audience can also submit questions online at our Q&A portal. That's at texastribune.org/ask. We are grateful for the support of our sponsors. Our major sponsors are Methodist Healthcare Ministries and the Houston Endowment, and our foundation sponsor for today is the Henry Luce Foundation. Though corporate sponsors and donors underwrite this event, they play no role in determining the content, speakers, or line of questioning. And at this moment, we do also want to thank our partners at Odessa College for hosting us not only for this event, a listening session we're doing this afternoon, but for yesterday's event on the state of oil. Spring Member Drive is one of the times of the year when we at the Texas Tribune ask the people who appreciate our events and our journalism if they would make a donation to become a Texas Tribune member. Tribune members make everything we do possible, including these free public events. To learn more and to become a member, visit texastribune.org/support. And lastly here, I'd just like to call attention to a couple events, and then I'll introduce the panel. Our next event on May 22nd will gather in Dallas and online for a program focused on how Texas communities are finding innovative solutions to better address young Texans' mental health needs. We'll explore the work being done in schools, healthcare, child welfare, and restorative justice systems, how we create systems that work alongside one another to support every child, and how families can best support their children. You can find more information, including all of our speakers for this event, at texastribune.org/events. And lastly, reminder that tickets are now on sale for Texas's breakout politics and policy event, the Texas Tribune Festival, which returns to downtown Austin September 5th through 7th. Join us for 3 days of unforgettable conversations about the issues that matter to Texans at our annual celebration of big, bold ideas. You can purchase your tickets at tribfest.org. Now let's get to know our panel. Mitch Borden first got his start in radio while working at small radio stations across Alaska. He moved to West Texas in 2018 to join Marfa Public Radio as the station's first Permian Basin reporter. He lived in Midland, Odessa for over 3 years, reporting on the ups and downs of the oil industry, the COVID-19 pandemic, and local politics. Now Mitch is based in Marfa, but continues to search out stories in the oil patch and beyond. Patrick Canty has worked at Texas and California daily newspapers for more than 40 years. serving in a variety of capacities ranging from reporter and editor to publisher, a position he has held with the Odessa American since the summer of 2003. In addition to his publishing duties at the OA, Kenji serves on several community-related boards, including the Education Partnership of the Permian Basin and the University of Texas Permian Basin President's Advisory Council. And he's also the member of the Basin Public Broadcasting, Inc. Board of Directors. Benjamin Toff's research broadly focuses on the changing relationship between news outlets, the public, and how people navigate the political information environment. He's an assistant professor at the University of Minnesota's Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communication, and is the co-author of Avoiding the News: Reluctant Audiences for Journalism. From 2020 to 2023, he was a senior research fellow at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford, where he led the Trust in News Project, a 3-year inductive, public-centered comparative research project examining the drivers of trust in news across Brazil, India, the UK, and the United States. And our moderator today, Nic Garcia, is Regions Editor for the Texas Tribune, overseeing a team of reporters based around the state, including here in Odessa. Nic began his professional journalism career at Outfront, a Denver-based magazine that is one of the oldest LGBTQ news organizations in the US. He went on to work as a reporter or editor at Chalkbeat, the Denver Post, and the Dallas Morning News. Most recently was the politics editor at the Des Moines Register. All right, that's enough from me. I thank our panel and our audience for being here in Odessa and around the state this afternoon. And with that, I turn the program over to Nic.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. Again, I am Nic Garcia, the Regions Editor at the Texas Tribune. I like to say I have the best job in the world because, as you heard, I get to manage and lead a team of reporters who are telling the story of Texas from Texas. We have Carlos Nogueras here. We have reporters in Lufkin and Lubbock. Most recently, we added a reporter in the Rio Grande Valley, in McAllen. Could not imagine a better job. And today we are here to talk about news deserts and, more importantly, the impact on the changing and shrinking news industry on local democracy. Again, we have this esteemed panel here that I'm lucky to probe with questions. And I want to start off with, there is this old quote from Thomas Jefferson that newspaper people love. And it's, were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate to prefer the latter. And yet we are in an era where the prior is true. You heard some stats from Matt, but again, Pointer, the Florida-based journalism training school, earlier this year, or reported late last year, the rate of local newspaper closures has accelerated to 2.5 a week in 2023, according to a new report from the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University. Between 2008 and 2021, Pew measured that the industry shrunk by a quarter. Since 2008, it reported newsroom employment plummeted at U.S. newspapers while increasing the digital publishing sector. Newspaper newsroom employment fell 57%, from 71,000 jobs to 31,000 jobs. At the same time, the number of digital native newsroom employees rose 144%, from 7,400 workers to about 18,000 in 2020. Despite the sharp increase, the number of newsroom employees in digital native sector newsrooms remained about 13,000 below the number in traditional newspapers. Put another way, the internet, despite all of our best efforts, is not saving the news industry. Instead, we are becoming a nation of 150 million truths. That's the estimated number of TikTok users in the US. That's more than the 123 million US adults who watched the Super Bowl, and more than 5 times the number of people who watched the last State of the Union address. Ben, I want to start with you. Hearing those numbers, what, in your opinion, is a news desert, and what does it mean for local communities?
So Thank you, and thanks for having me here. The term news desert, our sort of sense of what we mean by it. Typically, what people are referring to is this study that was done starting in North Carolina, and now housed at the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern, where they've defined it very precisely as a county in which there's no newspaper. Um, and they've been tracking it for several years. By their estimates, about 3,000 newspapers have closed since 2005, which is about a third of all of the newspapers that they identified back in 2005. So by that measure, it's essentially a place in which there's no access to traditional conventional newspaper journalism. Now, that definition of news desert leaves a lot of things out. Of course, newspapers aren't the only place where people can turn for information. Broadcast and radio still play a really valuable role in terms of providing access to information. Online sources increasingly are trying to fill that void. So there's, we don't have a great sense of what isn't being captured that way. On the other hand, and maybe a little bit more pessimistic, just the mere existence of a newspaper in a community doesn't actually tell you whether people have access to valuable local information. A lot of those newspapers have, as you just said, really vastly reduced the number of journalists employed by them. They may not even be covering the communities in that location. And within a county, of course, there are a lot of different communities that may or may not be covered at all by those individual news sources. So I think probably the reality on the ground is in many ways much worse than what those numbers capturing, our sense of numbers of news deserts is actually telling us.
We're hearing a lot, particularly in the last couple of years, about ghost newspapers, right? With newspapers that used to have newsrooms full of reporters and editors now having one. My hometown, Pueblo Chieftain in Colorado, is a great example of one of them, and I think that's also true for a lot of news organizations here in Texas. Speaking of Texas, we're here in Texas, not Colorado. Pat, what is the reality in Texas? What do news deserts look like here?
Well, there are more and more of them. Since 2021, I believe 28 papers have closed in Texas. And maybe 7 of those have merged into other papers, but we're talking small papers, weeklies. I have an old friend, a colleague in Canadian Texas, which is all by itself way up there in the Panhandle. And that community lost their newspaper about a year ago. And
I wrote the story.
Yeah, there's really nothing else going on. So it's a big thing, and the industry's tried to work on ways to deal with that. In some cases, some of these papers close because the publisher who's owned it for decades and decades, they're old, they're tired, they need to retire. And they try to sell it, but they can't find a buyer. And so there was an effort to try to incentivize young college graduates, entrepreneurs that say, well, it's not the end all be all to live in a place like Dallas or San Antonio or Austin or Houston. There's some that look for this small town quality of life, and you could run a weekly and make a pretty good living at it and have a pretty great quality of life. But that's been even a problem attracting people to that, because at the end of the day, it's a hard business. I mean, you really have to have the passion for journalism and for serving your community to get into this business and stay in it. Because I'm a big believer that we really do kind of do God's work, and that part of what makes a community work is civic engagement. The people are involved in the daily workings of they go to school board meetings, they're engaged in their schools, their city government, their county government. And because they're engaged and they know what's going on, they're able to make good government by keeping it accountable. And newspapers have always played and continue to play an important role in that. They need to. We're the ones that keep people informed so they can be better engaged in their society. And what you're seeing now is it's getting harder and harder to do that. And part of it's because a lot of readers just don't find that kind of news sexy anymore, and they don't really want to read that. which then you get this vicious cycle. So therefore, they're not as engaged in their society and holding their institutions accountable. And so it's, it's a difficult challenge.
Mitch, is the Permian Basin a news desert?
That's a great question. When we look at Midland, Odessa, we have, two papers. We have TV stations with working journalists. In Marfa, we have a public radio station that is broadcast in the Permian Basin and the Big Bend area, and also a working, newspaper there too. But the Permian Basin is huge, and there are so many communities out here. I live in Marfa now. I drove 3 hours one way to get here today, and I have to do that for different stories when I'm not reporting from a distance. And so, yes, there are a lot of working journalists, but there's also a lot of things to cover. And I would say some are probably being lost because of a lack of people out here with their eyes on different stories playing out. I also think that even though there's a number of wonderful journalists in West Texas, the Permian Basin, the Big Bend, we also have to ask ourselves, what is their experience level? Are we retaining people for long term, or are people starting their careers here and leaving? And if that's the case, then I think every reporter is valuable in doing God's work. But if I was from Midland, Odessa, or Marfa, I would want people to live here and get to know this place, because there's a lot of nuances here, and to really tell the stories that matter to readers and listeners, you need to know a place.
Ben, there is no doubt that the news industry, at least since 2006, 8, you pick a point, has been contracting. And yet we've also seen the proliferation of smaller news outlets. A lot of them are rethinking how to do local news. I'm curious, what is your read on the impact on shrinking newspapers, shrinking TV stations, but also the increase in, social media influencers, nonprofit newsrooms like the Texas Tribune, maybe even smaller, like the Dallas Free Press? What has that mix and that reimagination of local news meant for democracy and local government?
So there's a number of questions in there. I'll try to. So I'll start with the sort of. It's not all bad, is what I should start with. We shouldn't romanticize how great everything was in the past. Local news has not the best track record in terms of covering all the communities in those communities that they're trying to serve, and in many cases have done real harm to segments of those communities. And so I think one of the positives that has happened with new technologies, new forms of media, new ways of accessing information, a lot of different voices that were excluded from local news in the past are now having a chance to have a say and to weigh in, and to do so in ways that are really changing the overall information environment in some positive ways that I think we don't want to overlook. And in that sense, there are a lot of ways in which people can access information beyond just local news from all sorts of other sources that maybe better fit the way that they live their lives. Not everybody has the time, unfortunately, to devote to reading a print newspaper cover to cover every morning. And so getting information from podcasts, from social media, from delivered in these other forums actually better meets the needs of people's day-to-day lives in many cases. And so I think there's opportunity there. Of course, there's a fundamental difference between being a sort of trusted messenger of information that maybe better captures or better connects with people in terms of their own lived experiences, and independent, rigorous journalism where somebody's gone out and actually verified information, gone out and tried to get their best sense of the truth of what happened in a way that I think, independent journalism can't be replaced with just people giving their opinions on social media. And I think it's harder and harder for the public to differentiate between those two things in the media environment that we live in today.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really great point, and already, and with all due respect to Pat, we've already kind of romanticized traditional newspapers, saying they do God's work. And I was born and raised on newspapers. I, love the idea of a big, newsroom full of people going out there with a notebook, and I mean, I can romanticize it like the best of us, and yet we know, to build off what Ben said, people have historically been left out. Newspapers have, actually in recent years had to print, entire special editions, to recant some of their previous editorials around, racism and redlining, et cetera. And, the thing that I always like to think about is the audience. And as much as my grandmother loved reading the Pueblo Chieftain cover to cover every day, she cut out Garfield comics, Dear Abby. She read the obituaries, right? She was not saving the big expose on city council. And so I'm really curious to hear Pat make the case that we need to save, or that there is a yearning for that true watchdog journalism that I think we all yearn to do as journalists. Right now in 2024, make that case for us.
Well, because I think that's the cornerstone of why most of us got in the business is integrity, holding elected officials and government accountable and making it as transparent as possible. Okay, I think that's where our value is. Because if you don't know what's going on in your community, and we've seen it time and time again, and we've seen it more recently in this area, just how askew government can go if not enough people are paying attention to the politics or paying attention to the issues or who's running for what or shows up to vote. Bad things happen. And the newspaper, I say a newspaper, we're not just we're a news organization because we're digital. We spend most of our time focusing on digital now. We still do a good job at that, I'll argue, even with reduced staffing. Just by filing freedom of information requests ad nauseum, we get access to all sorts of information that winds up being really great stories that keep our reader informed. And enough of them say, oh, I didn't know that was going on. And guess what? They wind up doing something about it. So I think nowadays it's filling our role as a watchdog. The issue is, and it gets to something you kind of were touching on, is with social media and digital, it allows other voices to come in and it allows us to reach audiences in a different way. But what happens is, and it's been happening on our side too, is people blur what's news and what's opinion. A lot of them, they don't understand that there's separate sections for news and opinion in a newspaper or a news product. But just as that, anybody or their brother can go on Facebook and start spouting off their opinion and create a site and say, this is my newspaper. I'm a citizen journalist. And all it is filled with what they think and misinformation, and sometimes it's libelous, and people see that. And including people that say, I just get my news off of TikTok and Instagram. And they don't realize what they're seeing, and they buy it as the God's honest truth. And so that kind of poisons the well, so to speak, and that doesn't do any favors to a community. But that's the value of a newspaper, I will argue. We still try to abide by standards and practices. We still try to be objective when call it balls and call it strikes when we're covering hard news, so that you get the information and then you make up your mind on what kind of opinion you want to have on that subject or that person in the office.
Mitch, speaking of standards, you are one person in a vast region. How do you go about picking the stories that you think matter to Marfa listeners? And how do you go about trying to build trust, not just with your listeners, but the people who you are asking to share their stories with, and maybe a part of the state that is even more skeptical of the media than others?
Well, I mean, I think one thing is, we're talking about social media, and like I'm on, Twitter, I'm on Instagram, and I see people talk about, news in the world, and sometimes I'm just like, man, they don't care how they say things, they don't care what they have no standards, and like, as having an editor, being a reporter, like, you know, you really worry about how you characterize things, about the facts, and about fact checking everything you put out there to the best of your ability. And so that's one way I try and like build trust is just by doing the work, linking the documents I'm looking at if it's a big story, just making sure I'm quoting people correctly. I mean, those might sound like basic stuff, but like that is like essential. That's the cornerstone of like journalism, right? Whether you're newspaper or radio or whatever. And that's a good way just to start establishing trust with your readers, that if they can come to know that either what you say is always correct or you're willing to correct when you're wrong is paramount. And then just in general, like I don't know. I think with West Texas, the Permian Basin, I think maybe people are leery of journalists. But when I go out and report, most of the time people want to talk. Like people want to tell you their story, their beliefs, and they might be leery of you. But like if you are respectful and decently cheery, or just like serious, or you take them seriously, like they will talk to you. And that's something that's just like always proven to me to like I get reminded of. It's like be respectful and people will respect you, and just always assume that people want to be listened to, especially in news deserts or places where people they don't feel like they've been given attention or the due. If you go out there and you give them their due and just listen to them out, if you have the time, sit with them for as long as they want to talk to you, which is a privilege when you get to do that. You will be rewarded as a journalist and people will trust you. And the more you do that, the more you're seen doing that, I think people will trust you in general.
So in 2018, Michelle Wolf, the comedian, made a joke at the White House Correspondents' Dinner about CNN. She said, "You guys love breaking news, and you did it. You broke it." And that's really funny to me, maybe not in the room. But I am really curious about, the nationalization of our politics, the nationalization of our news, the over-reliance on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News. I mean, put aside TikTok and other social media, these cable companies that are flashing, alerts every 30 seconds that the sun came up, the plane landed. Talk to me, Ben, about news avoidance and how that is contributing to the erosion of local news on at the local level.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Pew Research Center in DC just put out a new survey, I think, just a few days ago, maybe last week. And one of the things that they found, and they're not the first time they found this, but when they've asked people about their perception of sort of the health of the news business, most people are pretty unaware of just how bad it is. So a lot of what we've been talking about in terms of the news deserts and the huge reduction in employment for journalists, a lot of that just has not seeped into the public's consciousness. And part of it is because they do feel like they're just inundated with information all the time, and so they expect like, well, how can the news business be doing poorly when I can't get away from it? And so part of what's happened, it's as there's been these declines in local news, people who are interested in news have access to more information than ever before, and so it's not that they are not consuming any news at all, that they're turning to cable news, they're turning to TikTok or Instagram or Twitter. They can fill their time in the day with every waking minute that they're alive they can be consuming news, and so they don't necessarily feel like they don't know what they're not getting. And for news avoiders, I think part of what they're expressing is they want to get away from this. They feel like they need to sort of tune it all out because it's too depressing, too upsetting, too frustrating, and the sort of emotional impact of them. They feel like it's important to screen it all out, and they feel like they need to screen all of it out. They're not necessarily differentiating between the local journalism that may have this kind of important, unique civic value in their own communities, and all of the national content that they're otherwise inundated by. For others, it's they don't feel like they can. They'll say actually it's not news, it's me, and they'll point to they're raising.
Wait, I'm sorry, you said people will tell you it's not news, it's me?
Yes.
That sounds like you're breaking up with a bad boyfriend. It's not news. Okay, go
Well,
on.
they don't necessarily put it in quite those terms, but essentially, they'll say it's not really about the media. It's more about the way that they live their lives, and they feel like they just do not have time or the bandwidth to focus on it, given the young kids that they're raising, taking care of an aging parent, working full time. People's lives are stressful enough, and so part of it is they're looking for other ways to stay informed, and they do feel like the technologies allow them to keep up with enough of the big stories about what's happening, or they can rely on their partner or their parents to kind of keep them updated. But they feel like it's a more efficient way to live their lives to sort of not be paying it a close attention.
CNN, there's something to that, because what CNN set off was, we used to have a news cycle. We'd put out an edition a day, or when I worked in the San Antonio Light in the good old days, we put out 6 different editions a day. But still, you had one general edition, and you had to pick your shots. These are the stories, these are the photos that we're putting out the next day. Okay, when CNN started, what it did was it took that cycle to 24 hours. And so basically you had talking heads with the news or whatever, and they had to fill that time. And so guess what? When you got to fill that time, you start thinking of all sorts of stuff to ask or question or talk about. And also you tend to put on more opinion. Because I always remember James Carville once said, opinion's cheap and news is expensive. Okay, and so they figured out, okay, we got to fill all this time. So we'll just talk about anything and everything we can come up with, and we'll do a lot of opinion. And then guess what? Viewers get confused once again between what's opinion and what's fact. Okay, and then when you go into a political environment that becomes more and more polarized, as we are as a society, where everyone picks a tribe or a corner, and then they'll assign a media outlets, okay, you're with them, you're not trusted, and they may base that on an opinion show they watch on that program or an opinion piece they read, but they tag you. And then guess what? And rightly or wrongly deserved, more and more people say, well, I can't trust news media because they're biased. Well, that may be confirmation bias or not, but that's, and so it is a problem. And CNN, it just changed it. And the other thing is this: nowadays, more and more people, because of technology, I can filter things out and just read the news that I'm interested in on the subjects that I like. And so guess what? I get to know more and more about less and less, or even more stuff about stuff that I agree with, and not necessarily stuff that I need to know more about.
Yeah, one of the things that was always about a general interest newspaper is that you got to see, even if it did leave a lot of people out, it still gave you a wider view than an algorithm will today. Mitch, I'm curious, what do you tell your friends who aren't journalists when they say, oh my God, I just can't watch the news anymore? I just can't do it. What do you tell your friends, your family when you hear that? Because I hear that all the time. I'm curious to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my first gut reaction would be, and I usually do that, I'm pretty off the cuff, is just like, I get it,
I hate it too. Yeah.
I feel like your reporter friend is the best person to say that to sometimes, because it's like, you think it's bad watching it, just let me tell you what it's like reporting on it. But I think also I think a lot of the times when I talk to my friends about what I'm working on, they're often surprised by the stories happening in rural America or in the Permian Basin, because the places they're getting their news doesn't cover it, and it's probably similar in a lot of places in America, that CNN isn't going to your town or telling these stories. And so, yeah, Pat, I'm sure you're worn out by local politics and news all the time, and I really am empathetic to that viewpoint, because it can really just wear you down. And so sometimes I just tell people, like, take a break, but, dig back in, because they're like, you might miss something huge. Last fall, there was an effort in Midland, and this effort is ongoing, but to remove books from library shelves, and like that could have totally been missed by like a lot of people in the community, that public library books were going to be recategorized or were put in a room and locked away, and that's a really big deal for a number of reasons. But if you tune out, you might miss those big stories, and then like 6 months later, you might like realize something's happened that can't be taken back, or will be really hard to like reverse. And I don't know if that makes sense, but take a break, but keep engaged, because things are happening that are going to affect your lives if you tune out too long.
Yeah. I'm curious to know, Ben, in your research, have you found maybe not the winning formula, but a winning formula that a news organization is re-engaging its audience, and it is having a positive impact on democracy, whether it is holding elected officials accountable, whether it is helping to improve schools, getting a food pantry open? Is there anything in your research that you're like, there could be something here?
I mean, there are a lot of individual examples of initiatives that I think look promising, but I think one of the challenges is it's not the same solution for all audiences. What's going to work to engage and build trust with conservative rural residents in communities that are convinced that journalists have an ideological agenda and are out to change the election, is going to be different than what you need to engage with, say, a 19-year-old who has they're uninterested in news because they don't see the relevance to day-to-day life. I think there are different kinds of strategies that are involved in trying to connect with them and sort of make the case for journalism to those audiences, but it's just not going to be the same thing. And what's challenging is I think in some cases it's going to be in conflict or in tension. The things that may work to try to connect with those younger audiences may just alienate those older conservative, ideologically sort of hostile audiences elsewhere. And so it's a really tough environment for, I think, any single news organization to tackle. I think some have, and I think we're seeing this too in the broader environment. You have more and more kind of niche news outlets that are more targeted at specific communities, in part to try to address this challenge. One thing I will say in terms of for audiences, and just to sort of build on the news desert metaphor, if we think about part of what's going on is, people in news deserts, they're still immersed in an information environment where there's seemingly endless sources of information. So much like being in a food desert, but you're actually surrounded by fast food and junk food, and food swamp. Yes, food swamp. And I think that's kind of analogous to the situation we find ourselves in. And so I think for audiences to be one response to people who say that they feel like they just need to tune it all out is to encourage them to be more deliberate about the types of news that they're seeking out, because it's not all the same. There are high quality local sources of journalism that are delving into those issues that are really of relevance at the local level, that aren't part of the same polarized, hardened divides that we see at the national level on cable news.
I'm going to pick on these guys for about 10 more minutes, and then it's going to be your turn. So if you have questions, please start thinking about them, and we'll, again, take them up here at the mic. Also, I just want to plug one more time, the Texas Tribune is in the middle of its spring membership drive. So if you're enjoying this conversation and want to make sure that there is not more news desertism happening, feel free to donate. TexasTribune.org/support. It is /, I think. So, Pat, I'm curious. you have decades of experience, and I'm pretty sure you're still a big fan of news organizations in the classical sense. But if you were going to, start your career all over again, and someone said to you, design me a news organization for 2024 that is going to engage and inform a local audience and hold and help improve the local government infrastructure, what would you do and how would it be different than what you're doing today?
Okay, well, first, you got to start with a business model, and it'd primarily be digital, but I'd have to look at the revenue streams that fund my journalism, because it's at the end of the day, it's how do I fund my journalism? Okay, that's what it's all about. And
TexasTribune.org /.
That's right. That's right.
And subscribe to the Odessa American. And
Click and
subscribe
like
to the
and
Odessa
share.
American.
But we're no longer in the we're not the primary market intermediary where we put you're a business and you advertise in the paper to reach eyeballs. No, so we have to primarily be more of a digital agency where we sell all sorts of digital marketing services, right, that may not have anything to do with my newspaper, but the revenue I make off that funds my journalism. Okay, that means I need to sell a lot of it. And try to be aggressive with that, because that dollar doesn't equal a dollar of the old print journalism, But then on the journalism side, I'd say we got to pick our shots. We can't be all things to all people, or everything that's fit to print or everything that fits. I think primarily we focus on being government watchdogs, covering city councils, city hall, county government, school boards, and giving that good hardcore coverage. And also, like I've said, the freedom of information request and say, okay, what's going on here, and that provides that public service to people that says, I need to know what's going on with my tax dollars or my elected officials. And then other than that, I think you backfill from that and you pick your shots on, okay, what other types of things might interest younger readers or readers in a certain group, niche that you're trying to grow. But I'm saying, I'm not. I've seen some news organizations, they focus on that first. Okay, let's see what the market wants. Let's see what the market is interested in. Well, I can understand the logic of that, but once again, I think we have a larger role, and it goes to that civic engagement. And there's certain things that you've got to do, and you got to do responsibly if you're going to fulfill your role in that. That doesn't mean you can't look for the covering trends or other types of things, but I think you can't lose focus of that. So if I was going to design something, that's how it would look. I don't know if that's vague or not, but the other thing is it's got to be primarily digital, because print, I'm sorry, print's going away. You can't find a press to print it anymore, and you can't find people to deliver it. So even if I wanted to do that, just from a practicality standpoint, it's not there.
So one of the things I did not mention at the top, but this was a stat that was reported earlier this week. The New York Times reported adding 210,000 new paying digital subscribers just last quarter. That is almost twice as the number of people who live in Odessa. What are they doing right, and how can local news organizations capitalize on that, learn from that, or is it just a phenomenon that can only happen on the national scale? And really, anyone can take that question if they have thoughts on it.
Well, a lot of it depends on the scale of the business. So the New York Times company, they have a lot of resources to throw at digital development and market acquisition. It's going to be harder for a smaller community paper to do. That doesn't mean there are things that we can do, but a lot of that does have to do with the ability of a large corporation to scale like that. There's still an ongoing debate of for example, paywall, whether to have a paywall or whether not to have a paywall. Wall Street Journal, going back, was one of the very first ones, along with Hussman over in Arkansas, that said, no, we're going to have a paywall from the get-go. You got to pay. Our journalism costs something. You got to pay for it. I know we've instituted a paywall several years ago, and we've grown our digital revenue, but we have fewer. The number of eyeballs hitting our site went down because people were used to seeing that, accessing it for free. So there's a lot of people that have tried paywalls that have gone back that says, no, you know what? I'm going to take the eyeballs. Just like in the old days, we used to sell paper subscriptions for practically nothing, because what we did was we took our circulation number, and that's what we based on what we charged to advertise in our paper. So there's still that ongoing debate on that, but a lot of it is because the New York Times can afford to do that.
Mitch, it looked like you were going to say something.
Yeah, I think, I think a lot of it does have to do with money. Like, the New York Times can do so much. They're not only a newspaper, they have a huge podcasting unit that's like creating great content. They have wonderful word games, and they are also a cookbook that keeps updating. Like, it's a wild thing to see them and what they become. And I think they really view themselves as a multimedia company. But I do think there's a way to emulate it in some ways. And I think, being a person who works in audio and mostly we're a digital outfit, but like we're doing, Marfa Public Radio does broadcast news. We have a few podcasts, but I think it comes down to finding ways for papers, radio stations, TV stations to collaborate. I think it's finding ways to work together and delivering a product for more local audiences that might be comparable to the New York Times. Like, the New York Times actually did a series about Odessa in 2020 that was wonderful, and they were able to pay, and I was the person on the ground with a microphone.
Well, that was you.
yeah. But we don't. Maybe we can't. Maybe we don't have the resources, our organizations, to pay people to do these multimedia work. But maybe we can work together and both find and advantages in that and create like a really good product, because we're really good at our jobs. Like Pat, the OA reporters are wonderful, and Marfa Public Radio reporters and producers are really good. And I think that's just more of a mindset, not just in West Texas, but across the board we need to be looking at, is how can we work together?
I'll just add, I think if you look at this kind of successful formula that the New York Times and others, but largely the New York Times has been able to do, a lot of it comes down to two things, I think, in particular. It's habit and the social element to what they're doing. So a lot of it, if you look at the numbers, a lot of the people subscribing, a lot of the increases in subscriptions have been through cooking, word games, Wirecutter, some of these other things that are not really core to the journalism that they do, but are really important in people's day-to-day lives. People appreciate it. They enjoy it, and they have this connection to the news organization that is based in habit and based in, they do Wordle together. They cook together. They trade recipes. There is this kind of social connection that is tied, that the organization is a part of, that keeps people sort of coming back to the organization, and then they subscribe to pay for the journalism. If you look back, there was a study done in 1948 in New York City. There was a newspaper strike. The study's called "What Missing the Newspaper Means." And they went out and talked to people about what do they miss about not having their local newspaper. And a lot of what people describe missing most back then was also not really core to the journalism that they were getting from those papers. It was, it was the society pages. It was the habit around consuming the paper. It was the weather, the sports scores. Some of these things now, you can get from so many other places besides your local newspaper. And so I think part of the challenge for news organizations is finding how do they still have a sort of important, relevant, daily, habitual role in people's lives, so that they have this connection to the news organization, and they sort of, on the side, get that really important public good, which is that civic information that isn't really going to come from anywhere else.
I do want to get audience questions, but really quick, you have studied this issue in multiple countries. Is there anything the U.S. media the journalists here in the Permian Basin, in Texas, in the American West? Is there anything we should be paying attention to or taking away from other countries that are doing it right?
Well, I mean, this is a hard thing to apply to this country, but one of the biggest
Try.
distinctive differences is a lot of countries have public dollars that go to support journalism. So in the UK, the BBC is the primary source of news for much of the country. It's funded through TV licenses that people, essentially taxes people pay, that go to support the journalism. That a lot of countries around the world, that's actually how they do this. It's probably a non-starter in this country, although there are some who are sort of advocating to do more and more of that.
I love listening to the BBC radio at night when like the NPR station goes to bed and they turn on the BBC. It's fun. I think we have some questions from our online viewers.
Yes, and for those who are joining us here in Odessa, you are welcome to head on over, ask questions from here. We just ask that your question end with a question mark so that we can get to as many questions as possible. But some really good questions that have come in here. This person writes, what strategies can be employed to enhance media literacy and critical thinking skills among residents in areas impacted by news deserts? I was lucky to have had a course where I learned about media literacy, but what about those residents who are not able to learn about media literacy in the classroom? And I will just add, and how do you do so in a way that doesn't come across as condescending and tell people you're not doing it right or you're not smart enough to consume media the way you should?
It's almost like, they don't teach civics in school anymore.
Well, there used to be, and there might still be newspapers in education, right? It was a nonprofit that you still do that. Talk a little bit about newspapers in education.
So newspaper in education is we send newspapers to classrooms, or they get online access, and teachers use the newspaper with lesson plans to teach, different things like social studies or geography, but in doing so, it helps kind of grow, we think, grow young readers. It teaches children at a young age, okay, this newspaper is actually a valuable resource that I can use in my life for different types of things. And I think to the extent that we can continue to do that, that's good. That's funded all through volunteer dollars. We members of our community contribute every year to support that program, so teachers don't pay anything for it. I think that's important. And I think newspapers in general have to think of more ways to do that themselves. And I think they can, if they did more things like town halls and got back to focus groups, things like that, I think that would be really beneficial.
I think we have a question in the audience.
Sure. I said I was going to be here to heckle a little bit. Craig Stoker, for those who know, I only don't know one of you, and I think I'll end with a question with all this. But Pat, you spoke a little bit about a new model being digital, and so many of us know that so much of the news now plays out on Facebook. And you also spoke about other news groups that we have, two of which in town, the Odessa Headlines and the Accountability Project, that report things that just aren't true. You can find things weaved throughout their stories that may have a kernel of truth, but they just kind of run with it. And what I'm curious about is when you look through what both of those pages do on Facebook, they boost their posts. And so they get eyeballs on it through ads. And if you go back through the ad library, the Accountability Project has spent over $80,000 boosting posts. Jeff Russell spent over $10,000 boosting posts. And if you look up the Odessa American, zero. So is it an ethics decision that the newspaper doesn't boost any of the posts? What is the decision behind where this post is organic and we just going to cross our fingers and hope it goes somewhere?
That's because we trust the credibility of our work, and so they're boosting because they got an axe to grind against us or whoever. Right. You don't get eyes on your post on Facebook unless you pay for it. Right. Well, we're thinking of making changes where we go back to no paywall, and so that might change. But at the end of the day, no, we're not going to play that game because we don't have games to play.
And to be clear, I do want to say I have worked for other news organizations that have paid for boosting posts. I think it's a newsroom by newsroom decision. I think the New York Times, the Washington Post, they have definitely paid for certain posts to go up. It's one ways that you get subscriptions. So it's not just a trick. There are other legitimate news organizations that do pay. It's part of how Facebook has made money off of the backs of news organizations, frankly, for right or for wrong. But
Yeah, we don't, and you brought up the fact that we have the paywall, and so the other reason is that it's like, well, if you have a paywall, and you boost something, come on over here to watch, but you can't watch, so.
we have another question in the audience.
Yeah, my name's Ronnie Lewis, and I want to follow up on what Craig said about boosting. I was in that battle just recently with the Odessa headlines and accountability, but what we noticed about that boosting is it got comical. I mean, they were putting ads, they were putting stories out, and they were getting comments from Yuba City, California.
We want to,
Right,
if we could keep we want to remember this is a statewide conversation and want to keep it to a little generalization
Right,
rather
I
than
was just taking up for the Odessa American.
Sure.
I'm a prolific contributor to the Odessa American for people that don't know it. Anyway,
have a question,
would you
sir?
agree with that, Pat? Anyway, one thing off the boosting now, but I agree with you. But for the average person, anybody paying attention, seeing the boosting, it gets pretty confusing. But back to what our discussion is about, what can be done to make it cool again to take a paper? Like, for instance, when I was growing up in the late 50s, if you walked in a room and an adult had a newspaper open, you better be good. I mean, it was absolute. And prior to that, it was a radio in the 30s. But so what's happened is if they shifted from it, if this election that we just went through, I was appalled that people didn't know things that were just so important, but they didn't know. But is there anybody ever thought about any marketing? Like for instance, we have the Don't Mess with Texas. You don't even see that anymore, but we all know it.
Yeah.
So if there's some way you could just make it cool again to take the paper and get informed, it just any kind of, I know it's a Hail Mary, but it's worth a try.
Then
Marketing.
Make information sexy again. How do you do that?
Read the paper.
I mean, I think it's probably a losing battle to get young people to pay for a print newspaper. Maybe not, but yeah, I mean, I think I do think like journalism as an industry can do a better job of selling the unique value proposition of independent, rigorous reporting, the journalism that is, I think for a lot of people, that is part of the challenge is people don't see what is different about this story versus, the 15 other headlines they're seeing, maybe even on the same subject. And I think sometimes the reporting, it's sort of taken for granted that people understand what was original journalism that went into putting this together versus all the other things that people are seeing. And I think that's where I do think at an industry level, collectively, I think the profession can do a better job of selling what is valuable and unique about what it is that journalists do.
We'll do a couple more questions here. We'll make sure we get to this gentleman's question as well. This person writes, why are there no local programs to help students who are wanting to get into the media and news? The majority of our news reporters are from out of state, which is not fair to those who are local, simply because we do not have access to the education and training needed in the media field. So there's that question, and then Ben, are there other ways in which young people who are looking to get in, if there aren't some of those resources, that can be helpful?
There are, here and there are efforts to try to do this. There is an organization called Report for America that will sponsor young journalists, aspiring journalists they'll work with local news organizations to place them, and they'll pay part of their
Three
salary.
members of my team are from Report from America, including Carlos. wherever you went to?
Some universities will also, I'm at the University of Minnesota. Our School of Journalism has a lot of resources that we will support our students to take internships, and then at which we pay. The journalism school pays for them as interns to work at news organizations. We have a small program now, also during the summer, where they'll work with newspapers in Greater Minnesota that they're paid from the school, in the hopes of placing young journalists in smaller, more rural communities outside the Twin Cities. And a lot of universities have similar kinds of programs. Not a lot, but I think those who can, I think you are seeing more of those kinds of efforts. There's an organization based out of Vermont called the Center for Community News that is, a lot of their focus is sort of creating more of these partnerships between universities and local communities to try to fill some of these reporting journalism gaps that we're seeing, all over the place. And part of it is to enable opportunities as well for career pathways for young journalists, aspiring journalists. But it's tough. It all takes money and resources, and so that's what it comes down to. And some states are actually putting public money to support these kinds of programs. I think New York just passed some legislation towards that. There's an organization called Rebuild Local News that's focused on lobbying state legislatures to put resources towards these kinds of efforts.
Patrick Canty and Ben, I didn't catch your last name, both talked about the economics models of digital journalism. Digital journalism also has a black eye because of so much of the junk that goes around. How can we entice better quality and more good digital journalism like Marfa Public Radio and the Texas Tribune and maybe some others, and get people to, including the schools, to promote people to partake of that?
Two ways. One is to act like a PGA golfer. In other words, I just focus on my game and do the best I can. And so to the extent that my news organization can continue to push the needle and do better, more high quality work, I think that helps. The other thing, and it goes to something that Mitch said earlier, is partnering with other media organizations. As things get harder and harder on each of us in this landscape, we find ourselves doing exactly that more and more. And the collaborations tend to have some amazing outcomes that benefit, the radio station I'm partnering with, or the PBS station, or the local, CBS affiliate. It helps the quality of their product, and it helps the quality of mine. And also we cross promote, and also we have a great time doing it together, and we build friendships and professional relationships. So those are two ways that I see as we could do that.
I also think that Marfa Public Radio, I think, has a lot of work to do in this area too. But I think holding events like this, whether it's with schools or with the public, like engagement events and putting efforts into engaging the public, is essential. You can't just do the reporting, post the story, and expect people to see it, kind of like what Craig was saying. And I don't have the answer for that. I'm a reporter, so I usually just, do the story, post it, and whatever. But just going to people where they are is a great way to cultivate an audience and to just let people know you're out there doing the kind of work you're doing, alongside collaborating.
I agree with all that has been said, but I will also say, news organizations need to be careful to not assume that the problem is the public. That no other industry, when people don't want to buy that product, go around saying, well, something's wrong with the public that they don't want what we're putting out. And I do think that there's a danger for news organizations to feel a little too because there is this civic mission that I do think is important. I think to sort of pat yourself on the back and say we're doing it right. People just don't understand the value of what we're doing, and I think that's where news organizations can do a better job of also listening to the public. That's where I think events like this are really helpful. But to try to understand why people are not interested in what you're producing, and Some of it is, people don't see themselves reflected and represented in that news, particularly young people. And I think they're making efforts to try to include them in the journalism and include them in listening sessions or events sort of is one way to try to step towards that. But I think if you want to get these audiences to be excited and engaged and interested, it also means including them in the news gathering process and doing stories about things that they do actually care about.
Gentlemen, thank you for a wonderful conversation this afternoon. Again, Mitch Borden, Patrick Hantee, and Ben Toft. I am Nic Garcia with the Texas Tribune. A reminder that we are in the middle of our membership drive. Please donate today, texastribune.org/support. Thank you all.